Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yes, y'all. What's going on? This is Baraka Blue, and you're tuned into Path and Present Podcast. Sending love and light to you and yours wherever you may be in the cosmos. This episode is with Dr. Professor Leonard Lewisohn, who is one of the world's chief specialists in Persian Sufi poetry. He's someone whose work I've been following for a while. He's written extensively on everyone from Rumi to Hafez to Saadi to others. He's translated a lot of Persian poetry. He's worked with Robert Bly on translations of Hafez, and he's written a lot of interesting articles on the symbolism of Sufi poetry. He wrote a great article on the Sama, which is the audition or the sacred listening ceremonies, particularly as Maulana Rumi understood their power for transporting one into ecstatic states. There's so much that he's done that I've benefited from as someone who is deeply in love and inspired by the tradition of Persian Sufi poetry, but is not a Persian speaker. So I'm not going to be too verbose. I'll put some links so that you can check out his work. But one of the things to mention that he's been doing is something called the Maulana Rumi Review, which is a publication that he is the editor of. And they put out an annual collection of articles about Maulana Rumi, about his writing, about his life, about the Mevlevi order that was inspired by him, about all type of aspects relating to Rumi. And it's something that's academically rigorous, but at the same time, I find a lot of those articles also deeply spiritually inspiring and have a profound effect on the heart. It's not just all in the head. So I would encourage people to check that out. He's also a professor at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. So I was able to sit with him on a recent tour in the UK, and we spoke about a whole range of things. Primarily, we looked at Rumi, Hafez, and then the tradition of Persian Sufi poetry more generally. It was a great blessing to sit with him, and I hope to be able to follow it up because this was just a drop in the ocean, as it were. All right, y'all, if you want to support the podcast, send love, send light, send prayers, share it with anybody who you think it might connect with. Subscribe on iTunes, like, rate, all that stuff. It helps. It helps it spread. And then if you have the financial means to support, we would greatly appreciate that as well. And you can do that on Patreon, patreon.com/path and present. That allows you to give whatever amount is easy for you on a monthly basis. Yes, y'all. It's all love. All right. I'm just going to say over and out. I'm recording this from Chicago. Had a beautiful retreat with Iman, Inner City Muslim Action Network. It was a powerful, powerful time with many of the great artists that inspire me from the United States. And doing a retreat, the Zawiya North America this weekend, which is with Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah, and is focusing on the concept of the fitra, the primordial human nature, the inherent soul and spirit of the human being. So I look forward to that. I'm going to be reciting at that. But that's all for now. I'll have some dates in the next podcast, but that's basically what I have in the immediate future. Mid-November, I'll be in Malaysia for a conference. I think it's the 17th, 18th, and 19th, called The Sacred Path of Love. If you're interested in that and you're in Malaysia, you can check out my Facebook for more details. All right, y'all. One love. So, I guess we could start by what got you into Persian poetry, Sufi poetry? What was your pathway in to devote your life to that?
In my father's library, I came across Nicholson's Rumi Poet and Mystic, which A.J. Arbery had put together with a selection of Nicholson's verse translations from the Masnavi that he'd put together right after Nicholson's death. And I was 16 or 15 years old at that time, and I was absorbed in writing poetry, and especially was very interested in the surrealists and in European schools of poetry at that time. And I immediately understood that there was something extraordinary about Rumi in terms of the metaphysical depth of this poetry, which was unlike anything else I'd ever read. And it wouldn't leave me. I was just so impressed by it. And I had two reactions. One is that this could all be fake or phony, and the other is that it must be either true or beyond my comprehension. I decided that the latter was the truth. So it stayed with me that I needed to learn Persian and be able to read Rumi. So eventually, I ended up going to Iran in a few years' time, before my teens were over, and living there and getting my BA there, and learning Persian.
And this was in the 70s?
This would have been around 1970 that this encounter with Rumi in my father's library occurred. He had a huge library. And then in 1973, I ended up going to Iran.
So what was it like in the mid-70s in Iran, learning about Sufism, learning the language, pre-revolution? Like, what was that like?
Well, it was a very dynamic place. And after a few months in Tehran, I moved to Shiraz and enrolled in Pahlavi University, which was based on the model of the University of Pennsylvania. And so I enrolled in a BA in the Department of History, and all the classes were taught in English because it was modeled on the University of Pennsylvania. Although those classes in Persian literature and in history itself were taught in Persian, although this was supposedly not supposed to be done, but the students persuaded the teachers to teach in Persian. So I had to learn Persian very quickly and to get up to that level. But it was a very dynamic place. There was an arts festival which occurred every year in Shiraz, sponsored by the Queen. All sorts of companies from abroad would come. Peter Brook came. The Royal Shakespeare Company came. So it was very dynamic. Some of the greatest singers of Persian classical poetry were just beginning to blossom and becoming known, like Shajarian and Parisa. The Iranians were the most hospitable people in the world that I'd ever encountered. And at that age, of course, one is charming and young. And I got along with everyone, and I was having a wonderful time. I was living not far from the tomb of Hafez and not far from the tomb of Sadi, which I visited on a regular basis. So I had an idyllic time for about 5 years there.
So it was Rumi that drew you, but now that you've kind of lived in the world of Persian poetry, Persian literature for these decades, is Rumi still your favorite, or do you have a favorite Persian Sufi poet?
The answer is that the wisdom of these Sufi poets comes from everywhere and everyone. Rumi is a special case because every word that he uttered, whether it's prose or poetry, comes out of an ecstatic state which points to a higher metaphysical level, which guides the soul to God. So there's that quality of Rumi, which is always leading back to the ultimate reality. And when you read his poetry in Persian, he's always teaching. He's always drawing you forward. And The interesting thing about Rumi, just to digress on him slightly, is that he's always teaching you in a sort of inimitable way. It's almost if he's the supreme teacher, and every sentence he says, you need to hear the next sentence, and so you're always being drawn into the beauty of his writing and the profundity of it. And this is especially true of the Masnavi. So it's a kind of miraculous eloquence coupled with wisdom, which always gives you a direction. I've never failed to open the Masnavi over a period of 3 or 4 decades without immediately finding the guidance I needed. In fact, he's one of the main books that's used for divination in Persian. And so he's constantly providing guidance. I mean, he's the I Ching amplified several times over. So that's one aspect of Rumi, of course, the deep mystical side and the deep spiritual side. There are other poets like Hafez, probably number 2, who again is used for divination, purposes of divination. He's known as the tongue of the invisible. So he's always relating to the angelic world, the other world, and always giving you guidance from that realm. He's called Lesonal Babe, the tongue of the invisible. And then there are other poets such as Sadi. Again, he's someone who is inimitable in his writing and in terms of the language of love. He's a great love poet, and in terms of just practical worldly wisdom, he's the Alexander Pope and Benjamin Franklin rolled into one with the eloquence of Shakespeare. So, and that's one of the amazing things about the Persian language in general, is that you have 2 or 3 poets of the level of John Donne, but of the quality of 10 times the amount of John Donne. And you have 2 or 3 poets of the level of Shakespeare, and several poets of the level of Milton and Dante. And of course, much of this is untranslated. So it's a rich mine of world civilization, world culture, and world literature.
Yeah, there's a lot there that I'd like to hear more about. But I read the book that you edited about Hafez, and there was a lot in there that I learned. But I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit about some of the themes that you brought out in that book, which is that Hafez, there's this debate over Hafez, particularly because Rumi, it seems, is pretty explicitly basing what he's talking about in the Quran and Hadith. And you showed me in your library upstairs, there's whole texts showing the Quranic verses that Rumi uses in the Masnavi, as well as the Hadith literature. But Hafez seems a little bit more, you could take it either way as far as his metaphors and his imagery. And he's very critical of, not only the scholars, which Rumi can also be too, but he's even critical of the Sufis and critical of all these things. But you bring out this concept of the inspired libertine and this rebelliousness, as far as I understand it, really emphasizing this dislike of religious hypocrisy and to be like radical authenticity. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that in Hafez.
Yeah, the inspired libertine is called rend in Persian. And rend literally is from the carpenter's plane, rande, something that shaves off excess. So what you're encountering in this term is several things. First of all, rend, in common parlance, it means rogue. It means scoundrel. It means knave. somebody who's duplicitous, somebody who's an opportunist. So that's the negative side. And the Rendon, those inspired libertines, so to speak, were simply libertines who were scoundrels and knaves, and they were mafioso thugs. So from the point of view of the socio-political situation in 14th century Iran, in Shiraz, where Hafez lived, then they were the real rulers of the city there of Shiraz. And then the kings had to watch out that they didn't get on the wrong side of the mafia there. But the Ren was used by Persian poets for about 150 years before Hafez to signify the spiritual saint, the highest level of sort of spiritual achievement, someone who didn't care whether they had a good name or a bad name, and they belonged to what was called the school of blame, or the Malomati tradition, and they deliberately incurred blame from the public so as to mortify their souls and to lower themselves in the eyes of others and be raised in other words, to achieve humility and to be raised before God in a kind of that God understood who they were. Mm-hmm. So this term was used. You see, that they took the negative social terms and they turned them into positive epithets, so that the Ren becomes the symbol of, as I said, the highest saint. Then there's a whole movement among the Sufis at that time. Was a social movement which came out of the Malomati school, which is called la Calendarier, or the way of the wild men. And these were groups of Sufis who would wander around and shave their facial hair and sometimes walk naked through the streets and generally behave in a scandalous way under the auspices that they were breaking themselves and mortifying themselves, a bit like the sadhus in India today. So you had these groups of people, and of course there was a whole genre of poetry called the Calendarier genre, which Hafez wrote poems in that genre. And so there were 3 or 4 genres. There was the Malomati genre, the school of blame poetry. There was the Calendarier poetry, the wild man poetry. There was the Cabrier poetry, this Zoroastrian symbolist verse, again, an antinomian type of rhetoric. And then there was the Kharabati poetry, the school of the Tavern of Ruin. And all of these were deliberately scandalous ways of expressing yourself, but again, they refer to the highest levels of spirituality. It's interesting that Thoreau in his Walden says that the Orientalists tell us that Kabir's poetry has 4 levels of meaning. But today, we find it objectionable if a writer has more than 1 level of meaning in his poetry. So to get back to what you said about it can be taken either way, the essence of Hafez's symbolism is what's called the poetic device of iham. And iham means amphibilology or ambiguity. So there's a deliberate oscillation between the profane and the sacred. So what is radically profane can actually be very sacred as well, and vice versa. And one of the reasons is that that God can be perceived, that the world can be perceived as either a mirror or a veil. So if we take the world as a veil, then you follow the path of austerity and self-mortification and asceticism, which was not the path that Hafez took, and you want to turn away from the world. You can take it as a mirror that the whole world reflects God. And so Hafez followed this path which was called Shahed Bazi or Nazar Bazi, where he contemplated beauty in the world, and he took female beauty, male beauty, all beauty as epiphanies and theophanies of the divine. So it was a school of love, and this was his mazhab eshk. So we all know that we're attracted to love poetry. There's nobody that doesn't like love poetry unless they're psychologically sick. So he wrote stunning love poetry, some of it quite erotic, but nonetheless, it can be interpreted on many levels. And because of the multi-level layer of the symbolism, it communicates itself to the soul in a way that the dream does. You can have a dream, and that dream may mean more to you than 100 days of consciousness, but you don't know exactly what the dream means, but you know what it means to you. So it's communicating to you, and it convinces you in a non-rational way. It's truth. So the poetry of Hafez is similar. They're multi-layers, and it's convincing. It convinces the unconscious. It's something that you are converted to his religion without you professing his religion. So for that reason, you have atheists who love Hafez, and you have pious mullahs who love Hafez, and you have communists who love Hafez, and you have all hues and colors of people that love Hafez, and he's the most popular poet, and he's on every Iranian's and every Afghan's bookshelf. This is one of the incredible achievements of his divan. And again, as I said, they use it for the purposes of divination because he predicts the future. You can open and he'll say something which exactly corresponds to your condition and your state and your circumstance. So that's some of some of the qualities of Hafez, and of course, he's one of the most frequently commented upon poets in Persian. So I have in my library at least 5 commentaries. I mean, one of the commentaries written in the 17th century, 5,000 pages long, 4 volumes, very small print. It was written in the 17th century by a Sufi in Lahore. And a very profound commentary. So people devote their lives to studying Hafez, commenting on it. And there's a special subsection in Iranian studies known as Hafez Shanasi. It's like Shakespeare studies. So you have a special studies of Hafezology. Another aspect is that after the Quran, people quite often memorize the Divan of Hafez because he encapsulates such wisdom. So you can go to the tomb of Hafez and find 14-year-old boys and girls from their grammar school singing Hafez. So because that's part of the Iranian culture, you memorize it, you recite it, and you'll get into a taxi, and the taxi driver will recite you a verse of Hafez or Sadi before you get out. It's just part of their culture. They imbibe it, they live it, and the poet. It's still a bardic civilization. So that's part of the richness of Hafez's language, so everyone is a Hafezologist. In fact, you can lose friends very easily if you make the wrong interpretation of a verse that somebody else doesn't like. They won't talk to you again because that verse belongs to me and I know I'm right, and so your interpretation is wrong. And so it's a very serious matter. It's
like we say in the West, don't talk about religion or politics at the dinner table, but in there it's or Hafez, be careful what you say.
But you didn't address this question of why Hafez, there's so many anti-Sufi remarks in Hafez.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's very simple, actually. In the 14th century in Iran, Hafez dies in 1389. From the middle of the 13th century to the end of the 14th century is the time of the efflorescence of the institution of the Hanagha, which is the Sufi lodge. And the efflorescence of this institution takes place all over modern-day Afghanistan, modern-day Pakistan, northern India, Anatolia, which is Turkey, and Iran, okay, and Khorasan, northern Iran, and parts of Central Asia. So you have a flourishing of the Sufi institution and the blossoming of the Sufi orders. So you had the major orders, you have the Kobraviya, the Sohrawardiya, and the Naqshbandi. These are the 3 main Sufi orders that prevailed at that time in the Persianate world. In other words, the world that was sort of influenced by Persian culture and where Persian is the main sort of lingua franca. that includes Anatolia. I mean, people in Anatolia spoke Turkish, but Persian was a main literary language. So from the death of Rumi in 1273 to the death of Hafez in 1389 is the time when this institution, where these main Sufi orders, the Naqshbandiya, the Sohrawardiya, and the Kobraviya, which are the main orders, and then you had minor orders such as the Qadiriya and the Nematulaiya and various others, the Yasawiya, and etc. These orders became what one Islamic historian, Marshall Hodgson, called a mass institutionalized religion. This becomes the main sort of central religion. In other words, Sharia-minded and Sharia-centric Islam, which is based in the madrasa and the mosque, in a way becomes marginalized. I mean, the Sufis become a dominant institution, and they're everywhere. Every time you walk out your door, you see somebody in a Sufi robe walking down the street. And as one of the great hagiographers, or one of the great biographers of the poets, named Dolat Shah Samarkandi, wrote, he says, "Hardshi khar mi shavad, hardshi besyar mi shavad, khar mi shavad." Whatever becomes excessive becomes despicable. So the Sufi organization, of course, it becomes a mass institutional religion, and so there's an abaissement de niveau mental. There's a falling of the mental level of it and the spiritual level. So there are many charlatans. There are many people who are just quacks going under the name of Sufis. And so this, of course, if you are somebody of the highest literary level of Hafez, even if you're pro-Sufi, even if you're pro-mystical, which he was, he is also a social critic. So he had to attack these negative manifestations of Sufi fakery and demagoguery, which were very popular at this time as well. I mean, he praised authentic Sufis and he attacked the false ones. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that if you look at Sufi poetry going back to the 12th century, early 12th century, late 11th century, the time of Sanoi and Attar, you find that there's something, that one aspect of the Sufi poetry of the time itself is anti-Sufi. In other words, their whole, for instance, Sanoi has written a Masnavi called The Enclosed Garden of the Truth. And the Hadiqeh al-Haqiqat. And he has major sections of that Masnavi which are on the criticism of false Sufis. Mm-hmm. And you find, even in poets such as Haju Kermani, who was contemporary with Hafez, Hafez's senior died a decade before him, and he wrote Masnavis as well, with sections on criticism of the Sufis. Although he was a devotee of Amin ad-Din Baliani, who was the Murshid of the Qazaruni order near Shiraz, and Baliani wrote a divan himself that Hafez imitated. And Hafez praised Baliani in one of his fragments. So the point is that you don't find any Sufi poets. I've not found one Sufi poet, and I've read about 50 of them contemporary with Hafez, who say anything positive about the word Sufi. Mm. The word Sufi itself has a negative connotation because of the social efflorescence of the whole Sufi institution that prevailed at that time. But that's not to say they were anti-Sufi. They were anti this type of public Sufism. And you find the same thing among anti-clerical writers such as John Bunyan, mm-hmm. In Pilgrim's mm-hmm. Progress. You find the same attacking of the exoteric clergy in his writing, or in William Law, for that matter, the great English mystic of the 18th century. So this is quite common in religious writing. And it's just because we are so far away from the social political circumstances that for us it seems strange. I mean, Spencer wrote The Faerie Queen, and it was in praise of Queen Elizabeth. But who remembers that? Who knows that the historical political circumstances behind his symbolism there? So it's the same with Hafez. You have to know the history and all of these nuances of the development of the Sufi institutions to understand the various allusions.
Right.
Yeah.
And especially with Sufism, which seems to be so much about cutting through egotism and ostentatiousness and anything which exalts the ego, there's this idea that if you take the Sufi path and you're wearing the garb and you're talking the talk, that everyone's going to think you're holy and enlightened, but that can become in itself the great veil to awakening. And of course, there's a saying in Arabic, which is, of course, from the early period, but it's Sufism was a reality without a name, and now it's a name without a reality.
This is actually from Sadi. He paraphrases it, and he says in the Golistan, Yeki az mashayek sham pursidan az haqiqat tazawuf. Goft, aval taifei budan dar jahan parishan, vali dar mani jam. Vaknun guruhi hastan, be mani jam vali be haqiqat parishan. And so he says, they asked one of the sheikhs of Syria about the reality of Sufism. And he said, they were first a tribe of people in the world who were outwardly disunited, but inwardly united and one. And now and this is, again, the time of the efflorescence of the Hanukkah institution. Now there are a group of people in the world who are outwardly united, but inwardly disunited. This is normal. This is, again, so this part of of course, Sadi wrote the Bustan, a great Masnavi, where he's praising Junaid and Bayezid and Shibli and Nuri and all of the great classical Sufis of the 10th century. But again, he can have that critical outlook on the actual physical Sufi tradition because of what's of the social situation that existed for the Sufis at that time. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could maybe comment and explain the idea of the madhab ishq. I know that, of course, Imam al-Ghazali, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali is very famous, and in the Arab world is very famous, although in many circles not as well known as he was. But I know that his brother Ahmed al-Ghazali, I believe, wrote the first text about the metaphysics of love in Persian, and it was very influential. So, and it seems like that this madhab of ishq was particular to the Persian world and had a huge influence, whereas in the Arabic world of Islam, you don't see an entire movement like that, where there may be an individual here or there. So I was wondering if maybe you could comment on that. There's so many different dimensions and levels, but we have to begin, of course, with the Quran and with the Hadith. There's a great book which has just come out about 2 or 3 years ago called Love and the Holy Quran by Prince Ghazi of Jordan. And one of the interesting things that he explains is that there are 4 or 5 different divine names which are actually names that mean love or beloved. So, for instance, you have divine name Al-Wadud, which means the beloved. You have Habib. You have many different names. So the whole idea of love is very much prevalent in the Quran. So it's there in a sort of in a sort of seed-like form there from the very beginnings of Islam. And then you have certain hadiths which actually speak about love, which are
always quoted by the Sufis. So there are many, but these hadiths are used to justify their ideas, and I'll come to them in a moment. But what happens is that you have, in the beginning of the Sufi tradition, in the time of Hassan al-Basra and Rabi', you have a great emphasis on asceticism. And the Sufis are turning away from the world and cultivating their souls and their inward gazing, their quietists. So this goes on until about the end of the 9th century. And then you have the development of the tradition of love with figures such as Tustari. And then with the 10th century, you have who wrote the first mystical interpretation of the Quran, very much love-centric as well. And then you have the development of the schools of love centered around Hallaj in particular in 10th century Baghdad. So you have the whole school of Baghdad developing with Junaid and Shibli and Nuri and Hallaj at that time. And Hallaj writes the first treatise where he equates love with the divine essence. So, there are many different attributes and names of God. And one of the names, of course, is Rahman Rahim. And of course, in Hebrew, one of the connotations of that name is love. And the Sufis incline towards that because love is an all-encompassing reality, which everything begins in love and everything ends in love. So around this time, in the Quran commentaries of people like Tustari and Jafar Sadiq, who is the 6th Shiite Imam, he has sections from his Quran commentary which were preserved in Solami's Haqa'iq al-Tasir, where he places love at the highest of 12 spiritual stations. It's the 11th station, and afterwards is ravishment. So it's one of the highest stations. And then, of course, Hallaj, with his doctrine of love as the divine essence, that's taken over by Avicenna, by Abu Ali Sina, the great peripatetic philosopher who writes a treatise on love called Resale fil Ishq, where he speaks of God as being the beloved, the lover, and love. So these three become united in God. So the Sufis begin, when they use the word love, they're actually talking about God. This is a theory, a mystical theory, which is elaborated over the centuries, and especially in the school of Hallaj. So the main the main upholders of the school of Hallaj are Abul Hassan ad-Daylami, who wrote a book called The Book of the Inclined Aleph towards the Lam. It's the first mystical treatise on love, basically. And he uses the language of Avicenna, he uses the language of Hallaj, and he tells all the different mystical theories about love. And then his disciple is Ibn Khafif, who again is a member of the school of Baghdad. Although he lives in Shiraz in Iran, he's very much in that Hallajian tradition, and he writes a book on love as well, although he's very much an ascetic. And then you have the blossoming of the first works on love mysticism, which is Al-Ghazali, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's brother, Ahmed al-Ghazali, who writes the Savaneh al-Oshaq, or the experiences of the lovers. And that's the first sort of major mystical treatise on love. And his disciple, who is the founder of Sufi metaphysics, Ain al-Qazada Hamadani, who dies in 1136, he's age 33, but he's a, amazing genius, again, of the highest spiritual level. And he writes a treatise called the Tamhidat, or the Mystic Prognostications, or prostications, you could call it. And that has a huge, long section on the Shahed, the divine witness of beauty, and on love, and on the lover. And so the whole language of what's called rose and nightingale mysticism, which is developing in Persian poetry of Sana'i at this time, goes into formal Sufi metaphysics. So there's a whole blossoming of the school of love. So the language of Sufism, especially in Persian, becomes foremost a language of love. Instead of a language of theology and a language of kalam and debating the divine names and hair splitting over theological principles, it's a mystical language which is using poetic symbolism. And so you find this in prose and in poetry. So even at this same time, a few decades after Ain al-Ghazat, you have the composition in Persian of the greatest Quran commentary in Persian called Kashf al-Asrar by Rashiduddin Maybudi, which is in the modern Persian edition, it's like 10 volumes. And again, he's using the symbolism of love to interpret the Quran, and when he has three different levels of interpretation of the Quran, but the Sufi level, which he has, which is the third level, all concentrates when it can on this mazhab al-ishq, on this religion of love, and Maybudi took it from most of his ideas from his spiritual master, who was Abdullah Ansari, who had written this treatise called Sat Maidan, or the 100 Fields of Spiritual Progress, on the spiritual stations in Sufism. The first station being Tawbah, or repentance, and the last station, lo and behold, is the 101st station, which is love. And Ansari says all of the other stations, the station that follows Baqa Billah, or subsistence in God, is love. So all of these stations are absorbed in the top station, which is love. So there you go. So from that time on, we're talking about the middle of the 12th century, beginning of the 12th century, the whole Persian tradition becomes a tradition where love is spoken of as God, and love becomes the main topic of interest. And then there's a famous Arabic hadith, or Arabic proverb, which is al-majaz qantatarul lil-haqiqat. The figurative is a bridge to the real. Mm-hmm. So the Sufis reasoned, well, what about human love? What about the love between a man and a woman? How does that relate to this divine love? And they came up with the theory which I call the theory of bridge love, mm-hmm. that this love, the human love, is a bridge to the divine love. So you have to have human love. And that's where this erotic poetry becomes so relevant, because God becomes symbolized through the tress, the eyebrow, the lip, the curl, the coquettish glance. And there's a whole literature, symbolic literature, based on the parts of the beloved body, which is an erotic literature. And the Sufis are using this literature, and everybody knows it's a very hermetic discourse, but everybody knows what it means. It's publicly hermetic. Everybody knows it. And it's used by everyone. And so it becomes integral to normal conversation, this erotic love poetry. And it can be interpreted both ways. And so the poetry of Hafez and Sa'di dies in 1293, Hafez dies in 1389, which is where Persian poetry, the love poetry, really blossoms. All of this is based on this Sufi background of the mazhab al-ishq. Now, this background still continues to be relevant today. It's something that people, all Afghans, all Tajiks, all Iranians know backwards and forwards, and they're brought up with it. They breathe it, and they express their love lives and their emotional lives and their affections using this language, this symbolic language. And even the modern poets who are following T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and the latest latest modernist movements in poetry, they are using it still. So it's not something that's outdated, like you have in Japan, for instance, where Zen poetry is very rarely written anymore. So this is something that continues to be relevant today. And in the Arabic world, it's less relevant. There's less of this antinomian tradition, which means against the law. So this whole tradition, which is sort of scandalous, deliberately anti-religious, deliberately anti-pietistic, but at the same time very Sufi and very mystical, is less emphasized for a number of reasons to do with the history of theology and the history of the Islamic sciences in the Arabic language, which don't exist so much in Persian.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of leads into one of my questions, which I know you've thought about and written about, which is that the Persian poets, obviously Rumi is very popular in the West. Some say the number one selling poet, and it's a household name. In fact, Beyonce and Jay-Z just named their child Rumi. I don't know if you know that. But so the number one pop stars. And Hafez is pretty well known. But in fact, for quite some time, Western thinkers, writers, poets have been drawing inspiration from this tradition, from the, Romantics to the Transcendentalists, Emerson being a good example. And so I'd love to hear you talk about that. But also I was thinking about the fact that it's not the same for Arabic poetry. You don't see any, these individuals being inspired necessarily by Arabic poetry, to my knowledge, whereas something about the Persian poetry translates well into the Western context, into a European context or an American context. So I'm wondering if you have any reflections, if you've thought about that, what translates so well to such a different cultural context. And, many of these poets were writing 1,000 years ago. So, time and space seem to not matter. Something translates.
Us Westerners consider ourselves to belong to the first world. But in terms of poetry, we're not first world. We're really third world. The Persian tradition has the richest poetic tradition in any language in the world. And when it comes to mysticism, the top mystical poet in any language of the world is Rumi. And this is not my assertion. It's that of Nicholson, who translated all of the whole Masnavi into English. And so this is pretty well known and pretty much accepted. I haven't heard of somebody coming along and trying to challenge Rumi's position as the top mystical poet in any language of the world. Now, the question is, did Goethe know of Rumi? Who knew of Rumi in the 19th century? Who of the great writers? And the answer is that no one did. Okay, so the answer then says, well, why? Well, because they had their ethnocentric blinders on, and they were concentrating on Latin poetry, on Greek poetry, and their own classical tradition, and their own vernacular languages. So that's just the way the Western civilization was until when? Until basically the British went to India, and you had the classics of the Oriental classics published by Max Muller, the translations of the Upanishads, and then at the end of the 18th century, Sir William Jones translating Hafez into English for the first time, into a very, today, what's a very unreadable type of English language, Victorian language, which is, today very sentimental and saccharine, and one can't really imbibe it anymore. But he had a pretty good understanding of the Sufi tradition. Even before Sir William Jones, in the 17th century, late 16th, early 17th century, Jean Chardon, who a French diplomat and explorer, went to Iran, and he wrote a 7-volume Voyage en Paris, and he analyzed all the great Persian poets, from Rumi to Hafez to Shabashadi. He wrote long sections of his book on Sufism, not to mention describing the civilization of Iran and Persia, called Persia at that time. So there was some knowledge of Persia and Persian poetry at that time. And you even find references to Persia in Shakespeare, here and there in certain of his plays. So there is some knowledge, but the real knowledge of Persian poetry only develops when the works of Sir William Jones and other of the Orientalists, especially the German Orientalists, begin to be written in the middle of the 19th century. And so one of these Orientalists is von Hammer-Purgstall, who translated the Divan of Hafez into German. And he translated the whole Divan with facing German text. Now this went, Emerson got hold of this and began translating Hafez, and the translations of Sa'di's Golistan, I think Francis Gladwin, if I'm not mistaken, translated in the middle of the 19th century into English as well. So Emerson, who is the founder of the Transcendentalist School, which is basically, the Transcendentalist School is basically the American Romantics. It's two names, but one school. And they were, of course, the Romantic school is a school which is based on the Neoplatonic tradition. Now, Sufism is a Neoplatonic tradition. I mean, it's half of the vocabulary of Sufism is a vocabulary taken from Greek Neoplatonism. The other half of it is a vocabulary taken from the Quran and the Hadith. But there's no doubt of it, when the Sufi tradition actually develops in the 10th century in Baghdad, this is the same time that the Greek classics are being translated into Arabic. So there was a interpenetration between these two schools, the development of the peripatetic school, the rationalist school, and the mystical school, and they're both using the same similar vocabularies, especially in terms of psychology. So the point is that these Orientalists, Sir William Jones and others, Max Muller, von Hammer-Purgstall, and people like Winfield, who at the end of the 19th century translated the Garden of Mystery or the Gulshan Rosa Shavastadi into English, they all knew their Plotinus well. They all knew their Plato well. And of course, you don't become the greatest writer in American history of the 19th century, as Emerson was, if you don't read Plato and you don't know Plato backwards and forwards. And so the Romantic school is a school of Platonists who are immersed in the love philosophy of Plato. Shelley, for instance, translated the Symposium from Greek into English. He carried Ficino's commentary on the Symposium wherever he went. And he read Persian. He knew Persian, and he translated from Persian. Tennyson knew Persian better than Fitzgerald did. So, these people were super sophisticated. In addition to Greek and Latin, they knew Persian. They were the modernist intellectuals of their day. The teacher of Omar of Fitzgerald, who translated Khayyam's Rubaiyat at Cambridge University, wrote an article in 1854 in Fraser's magazine for Gentlemen and Country. Fraser's magazine for the country, something like that. And he opens the article with, "Who has not heard of Hafez, the great poet of Persia?" This is 1854. So the English intellectuals at that time, they knew about this. They'd read it. Of course, you couldn't open a magazine in the Atlantic Monthly with that title today, with that first sentence today, because nobody knows it anymore. It's lost knowledge. So there is an interface between the Neoplatonic thought of Plato and which is very similar to the Sufi theories of love. Nobody has really written on this. They used to know it better in the 19th century than they do it today because nobody reads Greek and Latin anymore. But the Orientalists at that time did. And so when they came across these translations by Sir William Jones, or they did their own translations, they welcomed with open arms the poets of Persia. They welcomed Sadi, they welcomed Hafez, they welcomed Rumi. And Emerson translated quite a lot of Rumi and Hafez into, if you go to his collected poems, you'll see that he's translations from the Persian. Most of them are actually translations from German, because he didn't know Persian. So this was very popular at this time, and it was very fashionable too. I mean, Emerson's pen name was Sadi, and so you can actually take the poetry of Shelley and interpret it in a Sufi manner. A lot of it, in fact, I had the great fortune of attending a lecture by Martin Lings some 20 years ago, where he did precisely that. He tried to interpret the poetry of Keats and Shelley in a Sufi manner, and it was rather convincing until Kathleen Raine, who was in the audience and one of the world's greatest expert on William Blake, stood up and kindly and very gently reminded him that this is actually Neoplatonic as well.
So I know you have the Maulana Rumi Review. Maybe you could speak about your intention behind that and that project, and just some of the articles in it and what you're trying to bring out with it.
Okay. Well, again, when we as you know, when Robert Bly encouraged Coleman Barks to free these birds from their cages, referring to Nicholson's very dry and pedantic translation of the Masnavi into English, referring to asking Coleman Barks to do this. This occurred I believe, in the late 70s, and thanks to Coleman Barks and his attempts at renditions of Rumi's poetry into English poetry, he became a best-selling poet in the U.S. And so the rage and fashion for Rumi's poetry, which existed in the 80s and part of the 90s, rivaled that of Omar Khayyam, which existed in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s and 1910 and 1920 in Europe, in England and the U.S. So he becomes a very fashionable poet. So basically what's happened in the last 3 or 4 decades in the U.S. and to some degree in Europe is the internationalization of Rumi. We brought him into our domestic home life, even though he wrote in the 13th century in Anatolia. So he's become one of us. So this means that at the present day, we have the Journal of Dostoevsky Studies, who wrote in Russian. We have the journal of certain obscure or famous, poets who wrote in Italian. There's a journal of Dante Studies. So there are journals dedicated to various poets that wrote in non-English, in languages which are not English, which are published in English. So if Rumi is the best-selling poet, then what would be wrong with having a journal dedicated to him, especially since he's the world's top mystical poet? So thanks to the funding which we secured from the Rumi Institute in Cyprus back in 2009, we launched the Maulana Rumi Review at the British Library then, attended by the ambassador from Turkey and the cultural attaché from Iran and someone from Tajikistan representing the government. And so it was launched formally, and it's now in its 8th issue. The 8th issue is in press. Basically, my concern as the editor is to bring the authentic understanding of Rumi as he has authentically interpreted by the scholarly and academic community in Iran and in Afghanistan, in the Persian-speaking world, into the English-speaking world. So at the same time, I want the review to be literary, so it's accessible to the youth. So we have a section where his poetry is translated into literary poetry. In other words, it's not just pedantic literal translations; it's actual literary translations. So we have a group of advisory council of various people, including Franklin Lewis and Alan Williams and Carl Ernst and others who are in this field and have written on Rumi, and they've contributed to the journal. And it seems to be very, very well. It seems to have been very well received so far. There are something like 50 libraries worldwide that have university libraries who have subscribed to it. Several other institutions, and so it's a niche for those who love Rumi. And I should say that, in Iran itself, where Rumi is studied in the universities, in every university in Iran, you will find someone who teaches a special course on Rumi. And this is becoming true even in the United States now. So you have at least 10 universities where there'll be a special course just on Rumi. So he's become an international figure, and rightly so. And he's the most frequently interpreted poet in Persian, probably in any Islamic language. So there are more commentaries written on Rumi than on any other poet. He's probably the most frequently interpreted and commented upon writer after the Quran itself. So it makes sense that there should be such a journal, and it's been very well received, I can say, and I hope we'll have the strength to continue for many more years.
I hope so. Well, yeah, I mean, I've taken a lot of your time, and I should be getting my train soon. But if people want to, for instance, find the review or any of your other work, what's the best way to do so?
There's a website. You can just go and Google Maulana Rumi Review, and there's a special web page at the University of Exeter. The Maulana Rumi Review is published at the University of Exeter, where I teach, and so you can go there, and then we have, in the actual review itself, we have a link which takes you to a page where you can subscribe to it by PayPal. So that's available. The institutional base for the Maulana Rumi Review is going to be changing from the University of Exeter. In 2019, it's going to be moving to the University of California at Irvine. So it will be based there, and inshallah, and it will continue for a few more centuries, we hope.
Hope so. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I've benefited a lot. As someone who doesn't read Persian, it's beautiful to see these works being made accessible, and especially because there's so much interest in people like Rumi and others. It's nice to see that, people can go from the memes and the very popular books and to dive deep and to take it deeper into the some real substantive works which explain the symbolism and some of the metaphysical worldview that inspire these writings. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Path and Present Podcast. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so in a few ways. One is word of mouth. People hear about the podcast mostly from people like you who listen and like it and say, I know someone who would connect with this, or who would feel this, or who would enjoy this subject matter. So continue to share with your family and friends. Secondly, you can subscribe, rate, and comment on the iTunes page of Path and Present. Subscribing means that the podcast each episode will come directly to you when we release it. And rating and commenting means that it will grow and come up in the iTunes rankings, which will allow it to be available and seen by more people. And then lastly, you can support financially on Patreon. Patreon is a site which allows people to give a small amount monthly to support art or any type of content. And we have a Path and Present page on Patreon. The link is on our SoundCloud page, SoundCloud/Path and Present. And you'll find the Patreon link there. And yeah, you can support there. We're greatly appreciative of it. I guess lastly, keep us in your prayers, your positive thoughts, and your moments of remembrance. And thank you for tuning in and being part of the global Path and Present family. One love.